All right, wonderful, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us all this evening. My name is Tamara Hansen. I'm the coordinator of Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, the author of 5 Decades of the Cuban Revolution, the Challenges of an Unwavering Leadership, and also an organizer with the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference Committee, which has come together for many different objectives over the time of the pandemic, but is a cross-border initiative of folks in Canada and the United States who are fighting together for an end to the criminal over 60-year blockade against Cuba and for a normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States. And so we're really honored to be here with all of you tonight for this special webinar where we are going to be celebrating with Cuba their most recent 16th edition of the Jornada contra la Homophobia y Transphobia, the Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia, their 16th edition, and also where we are recognizing the gains that Cuba has been making with the passing of their new Families Code just a few months ago, which our speakers will go into. I would like to begin by acknowledging that this event is taking place and streaming from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous nations. As we stand together and defend Cuba's right to self-determination, we also believe that it is important to recognize Indigenous nations and defend their right to self-determination. Some of you may know that from May 3rd to May 20th this year, Cuba held its 16th annual Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia. This year, the motto was, "For all families, love is law." And dynamic activities took place in cities across Cuba, which included many different types of events, including drag shows, academic dialogues, social and artistic activism and art displays, evenings of trova, music and dance, all across the island of Cuba, with a special focus on Sancti Spiritus and on Havana. The days began in 2008 and were initiated by Cenesex, Cuba's National Center for Sex Education, with the purpose of developing comprehensive sex education and guaranteeing the sexual rights of all people without discrimination. This year's theme, again, as I mentioned, celebrated Cuba's new Families Code, which after rigorous and widespread discussion was passed into law 8 months ago in a popular referendum in Cuba. So we're so glad that you're here to join us tonight for this special webinar. I would like to now invite to the virtual microphone Erin Feely-Naham, who is a longtime advocate against domestic violence and HIV/AIDS. She's also a Cuba Solidarity organizer since 1998 with the Cuba C Coalition and the July 26 Coalition, both based in New York in the United States. She is also a founder and organizer of the International US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition, and she's going to explain a little bit about the coalition's work. So welcome to the webinar, Erin Feely-Naham.
Thank you, Tamara. I can't say that I'm one of you are also one of the founders, because when we first started the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Committee, it was to do conferences, and it was Vancouver and New York that pretty much were working solo until it developed and it developed. And now I'm so happy to say that we are definitely an international movement. We have every state, you know, almost in across the United States, many people in Canada, Ireland, South Africa, all over the world. And that's really, a lot of that is due to Canada, who has those wonderful 24-hour pickets that were so instrumental in, especially during the pandemic, in bringing people together and getting this message across. But my name is Erin Feely-Naham. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar, which is celebrating Cuba's International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia and the landmark Revolutionary Families Code legislation in Cuba, an example of real grassroots participatory democracy, unlike what we see in the United States, which we'll see today, which we see today in the US, which is terrible. The Supreme Court getting affirmative action as they previously attacked abortion rights. So basically, you know, it's, I don't want to talk about the US, it makes me sick. This is the first of a new series of webinars the International US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition will be holding over the next months on subjects like answering the China spy base hysteria and the Cuban economy under siege. I'm sure everybody watching this knows about all of the propaganda and the attacks that Cuba has endured for 62 years, but which continue and have been ramped up recently. It's more important than ever as we move into the fall to continue our anti-Black blockade actions. The International US-Cuba Normalization Committee now meets every 2 weeks. We hope if you're interested, you will join us. We have several, as I mentioned, several of webinars that are starting. There's going to be something also happening on October 6th with CARICOM. There's many different activities happening, and we hope you will join us. You can look at the website on US-CubaNormalization.org. Cuba Normalization, right, .org. That's been too long. So we're just back from DC after a great weekend of actions on 6/25. The NNOC and I'd say there were about 350 people. It was a wonderful event. There were activities all week long, and this built on the momentum I think that we had gotten when the US-Cuba Normalization Conference had their big conference in March in New York City at Fordham Law School. That was a great event where we brought in all sorts of people from all sides with different viewpoints. And I think that momentum was carried through, and DC did a fantastic job. It was a great event this weekend. So I hope we continue to move, to build our movement and unite, reaching out broadly. Down with the blockade.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that excellent introduction to the work of the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. The website information is in the chat for people to learn more about the work that we've been doing. And if you're interested to make sure you get meeting announcements, let us know in the chat, and we'll make sure that you get invited to our next meeting, which is going to be on Sunday, July 9th. And as Erin said, we've got some webinars and other actions that we're planning that we'd love to get more voices and more folks involved in organizing. All right, I'm now very honored to present to all of you a video greeting that we have from Mariela Castro. She is a leading activist for queer rights in Cuba and the director of Cuba's National Center for Sex Education. She's also a deputy to Cuba's National Parliament, the National Assembly of People's Power. And of course, she is also the daughter of Raul Castro and Vilma Espin. The work that Mariela Castro has been doing has been really invaluable in terms of bringing the rights of the queer community to the forefront in Cuba, and trying to break through some of the challenges that Cuba faces, whether it's machismo or homophobia and transphobia, trying to raise awareness about these issues in Cuba. And so we're really honored to have this special video greeting from her. Again, it is in Spanish, so our translators will be translating it into English. If you want to hear the English interpretation, please make sure that you have put yourself in the interpretation room for English on Zoom. So again, that is a button at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. Please change it to English. All right, let's go to our video greeting from the wonderful
y compromiso. Les quiero dar un saludo
I would like to
a los
greet you
participantes.
all.
Bien, pues con mucho placer y compromiso.
It's wonderful to
Les quiero dar
meet
un
you. I
saludo
would like to
a los
greet you
participantes de la
all,
conferencia
the
por la
participants of the
normalización de las
conference
relaciones entre Cuba
for
y
the
Estados Unidos.
normalization of the
Pero
relations between
además
Cuba
quiero
and the US. But
agradecerles
also, I would like to
por sus
thank
iniciativas
you
en
for your
esta loable
initiatives
tarea
in this
de
admirable
mejorar
task
en todo lo que sea posible las
of
relaciones entre
trying
nuestros dos
to
países.
renew the
Obviamente,
relations
entre
between
nuestros
our
dos
two
pueblos
countries.
existen vínculos históricos que
Because
se han
our
desarrollado.
peoples are
Pues,
joined by historic bonds.
también
And
algunas informaciones breves
I
con
would like to give
relación
you some brief information
nuestras conquistas revolucionarias en el campo,
about our revolutionary conquests or achievements
estrechamente relacionadas con las
that
amplias
are directly linked to
del
the wide scope of human rights.
realmente en las primeras décadas
In the
de
first
estos más de 60 años de
decades of
revolución,
this over 60
Cuba
years
era
of
parte de ese
revolution,
mundo en el que
Cuba was part
temas
of a
relacionados
world
con estos derechos que ahora se
in
comprenden y se trabajan
which
eran
the
vistos
rights we
de
work
una
for
manera
were
que se
denied.
ignora. Es decir, en nuestra
So
sociedad ha
in
avanzado
our
en la
society
transformación
has
cultural.
made huge
Todos los
leaps
esfuerzos
in
que se han
terms of a
hecho
cultural
en varias
transformation,
instituciones donde se destaca la Federación de Mujeres
because
Cubanas,
now we have
así
the
como el
Federation
Campeonato
of
de
Cuban
Internacional,
Women,
y ya en los últimos años
and
el
now in the
Partido
past few
Comunista de
years,
Cuba asumiendo ya el rol de
Cuba
vanguardia
has
del proceso
taken on a
de
role of
introducir en la
leadership
actualización
in
de la política económica
updating
y social el
policies
respeto y
to
garantía a los
incorporate
derechos de las
the
personas
respect and insurance
LGBTI,
of the
realmente todo
LGBTI
lo que tenemos que
persons'
celebrar.
rights.
No por ello dejar de seguir trabajando
So
en los nuevos
we need
desafíos
to
que nos
continue to
imponen
work on the
estos
new
avances políticos y democráticos.
challenges
Unos
that we
resultados
face
de
in
un largo
making this
proceso
political progress. And
de
this is the result of a
en el
long
marco de
process
estos principios humanistas
uh,
que
that
inspiran
we
el proceso
see and that
revolucionario.
are part of the humanitarian principles that Cuba has always
Que
defended.
es complejo. Cambiar la cultura
We
es
know that changing cultures is very
cambiar las
complex,
bases sociales de ese
and we
proceso
need
de
to have
transformación,
the
no
support
solo de la
of the
estructura de la
population,
sociedad, no solo de su estructura económica,
not only of
de
the economical structure of society,
de los
but
valores
also the
humanos,
human
de las
structure of
actividades
the
que están
persons who are
tan
part of
atravesadas por
society.
un pensamiento
Because we're talking about certain
explotador
types of
de siglos
prejudice
y que cuando se hace,
that
si no
dates
logramos
back
transformar la
from
conciencia, no
centuries.
podemos entonces hacer esa
So
sociedad deseada,
we
esa sociedad
cannot build
socialista
that
en la que
socialist
debemos
society
respetar
we want
todos los
in
derechos
the blink
de
of an
todas
eye.
las personas.
This will take time, but
Celebrar la
we will
Constitución de
defend the rights of
1950,
all
en la
persons.
cual se blindan los derechos
We
LGBTI+, lograr el
we
foro
want
de las
to
familias que reconoce la pluralidad familiar,
have families that recognize plurality and diversity.
importante, donde cada institución jugó su
We
papel.
want, we know that each
Ha sido
institution
líder
played
en la
its role,
iniciativa, sobre todo, de
and
presentar en todos los espacios de análisis, tanto
we want to
científico como
present
político, como legislativo.
our
Hemos
beliefs
estado
in all
presentando los
spaces of
argumentos científicos
analysis and our
que han
arguments, the
ayudado a
scientific
comprender y a
arguments that had
defender el
helped
lugar,
people
la
understand our new
de ellas,
initiatives
el reconocimiento y
and
garantía
the
de los derechos de estos.
acknowledgement and recognition
Nosotros,
of
a mí,
the
por ejemplo,
rights
no me gusta hablar
of
de
queer
comunidad porque
communities.
lo percibo como segregacionista. Nosotros consideramos que
We
todos los
believe
derechos son para todas las
that
personas,
all the rights are for all
todos los
persons
espacios son para todas las
and
personas.
all spaces are for all
Ni el barrio
persons,
ni la comunidad
regardless of
LGBT.
their neighborhood
Cuba
or
es
community.
para todos la
Cuba
ciudadanía.
is
Y
for
entonces,
all of its
esa ha
citizens.
sido una tarea que
So
nos ha
that
llevado
was
a trabajos importantes de diálogo
a
científico, de
task that
formación
has
de
taken a
activismo
lot of
por los
dialogue
derechos sexuales. Y
and a lot
gracias
of
a
fight for
este
sexual
trabajo
rights.
ya hay bases sociales que
And
fueron
now we
capaces de
have the
votar
social
ampliamente a
support
favor de la nueva
that
constitución de la
and that
República
was shown
y
in
que
the
votaron por el
vote
código de la
in
familia.
support for the new
Que tiene
family code.
muchos retos.
Of course, many challenges remain, and we want to ensure these rights. But we know that it is not enough to have a law, because now we need to communicate the law in an effective manner. So, and we need to have communication with society. So we are having these national days, which have given us a chance to touch the hearts of as many people as possible in Cuba. Because in Cuba, this issue is now completely different, and we are trying to leave behind our colonial heritage. There can be no homophobia in Cuba. So yes to socialism, no to homophobia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I want to apologize to our interpreters. The quality of the video the volume is a bit low, and so it was very hard for them, and they did their best. So I had hoped to send them the video earlier, but I was not able to. So my apologies to the interpreters for that very challenging task. You did great. What I will say is that we will get subtitles on this video from Mariela Castro and get it on the US-Cuba normalization Facebook page in the coming days. So if folks want to make sure that they're following the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition on Facebook, we'll put the link in the chat. Then you will be able to see in the coming days, we'll get the video from Mariela with subtitles up on it. Thank you so much to our interpreters always. Very excited. Also, thank you to Mariela for sending us that video. We know that she's very busy and has a very busy schedule, and so it's a great honor that she was able to take some time to send us such a thoughtful video. We are going to go now to our first speaker from Cuba. Sorry, our first kind of longer speaker from Cuba, Int'l Calzadilla Acosta. Unfortunately, many of you might know that it is very difficult for Cubans to join us live on Zoom because Zoom participates in the US blockade on Cuba. And so Int'l has sent us a series of videos where she is explaining some of the things that she wanted to make sure that folks in the United States understand about the work that she is doing in Cuba. She's also sent us some photos, and she's also planning to be kind of available on Facebook watching the webinar this evening as well. We are then going to be going to Luna Vasquez, who is going to be speaking with us from Seattle, followed by our final speaker, Asa Rojby, who is speaking from Vancouver, Canada. So looking forward to some amazing speakers this evening and then having a chance for Q&A and discussion. So I'd like to now introduce Int'l Calzadilla Acosta, the coordinator of the Isabellas, which was founded in 2000 and is Cuba's first group of lesbian and bisexual women. The Isabellas are part of the Cuban network of lesbian women and a member of the national technical team of the network, which is part of Cenesex, again, Cuba's National Center for Sex Education, which Mariela Castro is the director of. Int'l is a social activist for the rights of LGBTQIA+ people and against violence against women and girls. I had the honor of meeting Int'l for the first time when she came to Seattle for an event organized by Moon and the US-Cuba Women Collaboration, which was fantastic. I can't remember exactly the year, but it was really amazing. And when I was last in Santiago de Cuba, I believe in 2018, I was in a hotel just for a lunch with the Calixto Garcia Brigade, and there happened to be a conference happening called Evolucion, and it was a conference against violence against women and girls. And just wandering through this conference, I ran into Int'l, who I had no idea that she was in Santiago at that time, because I had understood that she was going to be traveling when the Calixto Garcia Brigade was there, but she happened to be in her hometown at this conference. And so that was amazing. We got a chance to chat with each other, and it was a very powerful event that she was participating in. So really excited to share with you some of Isel's thoughts. And we're going to go now to the videos from Isel. It's just going to take me one moment here to get those set up for us. Yes, also important. Before we hear directly from Isel, we are going to watch a short little video that her organization has created. This video goes a little bit quickly, but we do have the text for that. So I'm going to also include that in the chat for folks. So this is a little bit about how the Isabellas were created, and it's a kind of an introduction to Isel's work before we hear directly from Isel.
En la ciudad de Santiago de Cuba en el año 2000,
In the city of Santiago de Cuba in 2000, Isel Casadilla Costa decided to find out if there were other women with the same concerns and wanted to share their experiences and realities. They began in the boulevard of the city and then met in a place called Isabelica. Under the name of Santiago Group, they began to organize, and women started working on the prevention of STDs, HIV and AIDS, and 2 years later, their coordinator contacted the National Center for Sexual Education to request orientation to address the problems and vulnerabilities experienced by lesbian and bisexual women. And with the support of the institution Las Isabellas was created, and in December the 18th, the lesbian and bisexual women began to organize. They remember the people who took them with them to start working for human rights. Their tireless work has allowed them to gain visibility in Santiago de Cuba and also at the international level with the representation of their coordinator. The Isabellas have occupied different spaces for socialization, have articulated with NGOs, and have sensitized the population on issues such as a comprehensive education and on sexuality and stereotypes. And they have contributed to the formation of other lesbian and bisexual women's groups throughout the country. They have shared their achievements and challenges to stimulate the exercise of social activism for sexual rights. They continue to write their story every day, which is the story of many lesbian and bisexual women, and they want to promote the growth of groups at the national level and organizing to put an end to all forms of violence. 21 years after the foundation, the activists remember the commitment to all of those who joined the Isabellas or have contributed to their strengthening. 2 decades of social activism make them a reference, a role model in the country, and a place to go for empowerment, training, and affection.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Isel Calzadilla.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Isabella. I'm sorry, there's a problem with how you are sharing the videos, I think.
Okay, I'm pausing the video for a moment just to give the translation a moment. I have put the translation because I know the video from Las Isabellas and there was a little bit fast. So the Spanish is in the chat and we'll get the English into the chat as well. We're now going to go to the talks from our dear friend Isel Calzadilla, again from the Isabellas in Santiago de Cuba.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Isabel
Hello,
Casadilla Costa. Soy la
good
coordinadora
afternoon.
del
My
grupo Las
name is
Isabelas en
Isel
Santiago de
Casadilla
Cuba,
Costa. I'm the coordinator of
pertenecientes a las
the
redes sociales
Isabelas in Santiago
comunitarias
de
del
Cuba.
Centro Nacional
We're
de
part of the
Educación Sexual,
community
Cenesex.
networks
Muchas gracias
of the
por
Cenesex.
permitirme
Thank you very
participar
much
en
for
este
allowing me to
foro
participate
virtual
at this
para representar
virtual
a
forum
mi
to
país
represent
en cuanto
my
a los
country
derechos LGBT.
as regards
Bueno,
LGBTI
en este
rights.
2023 hemos
In
desarrollado
2023, we have
varias
developed
actividades
different
por motivo
activities
de la 16 Jornada Cubana contra la
uh,
Homofobia, la
as
Transfobia
part of the
y
16th
Homofobia.
day
El lema
of
principal
meeting
fue por
against
todas
homophobia and
las
transphobia.
familias, el
The
amor es ley.
main
A
motto
nivel
is
nacional
for
se
family,
desarrolló
love
en Maha
is
Provincia de
law.
Santi Espíritu la Jornada
This was
Nacional,
conducted
donde activistas
at Santa
académicos
Spiritu, a national meeting
y
where
pueblo en general
activists,
desarrollaron
academia, and
diferentes actividades,
common
dentro de ellas
citizens took
eh,
part in different activities,
presentaciones de
among them
libros,
different
actividades
book
literarias y
presentation,
culturales en las
literally
universidades, en las
literate
comunidades.
and
También la
cultural
academia
activities
desarrolló
in
maestrías
communities.
relacionadas con la
Also, there
sexología,
were master's
ferias
degrees
comunitarias,
related to
conferencias de prensa.
sexology, community
En Santiago
fairs,
de Cuba
press
desarrollamos
releases. In
actividades
Santiago de Cuba, we
principalmente
also conducted
vinculadas con la Universidad de Oriente,
activities linked
la
to
Facultad de Derecho,
the
entre estudiantes,
Universidad de
activistas,
Oriente, the law
profesores.
school, with
Expusimos los
activists,
diferentes
students,
logros, dificultades de las
professors,
personas LGBTI en nuestra
showcasing the
provincia
different
y
successes and
la importancia de la aprobación del
difficulties
Código de
in
las
our
Familias para
province, and
nuestras
also the
personas
importance of the
LGBT.
approval
Hicimos también
of the
debates
Families Code
referente a
for
los temas de la
LGBTI
diversidad
persons.
sexual,
Also, we held debates
donde
in as
participó el
regards
pueblo. Hicimos el
diversity,
día 16
sexual
de
diversity
mayo
issues. On May the
una jornada
17th,
importante con un
it
buró de
was a very
información de
important
diferentes redes sociales de
day
Santiago de Cuba para
with
dar informaciones.
different
Hicimos una gala
groups
artística
that
para
provided
desarrollar
information. We also held
actividades
an art
festivas con motivo de festejar
show
el 17
to
de mayo, Día contra la
celebrate
Homofobia.
May the 17th, the day against homophobia and
Personalmente, junto a
transphobia.
mi pareja, tuvimos
Personally,
presentes
with my
varias
partner,
actividades convocadas
we
tanto por nuestra red como por las demás redes en la
participated in
provincia.
different activities
Las Isabelas
organized by our
demostramos
network and
y
different
defendimos nuestros
other
derechos,
different
nos hicimos
networks.
visibles,
With
nuestros derechos
Isabelas, we
reproductivos y sexuales.
work
La
on
visibilidad
sexual and
lésbica,
reproductive
que es tan
rights and
importante
lesbian visibility,
para
which
que
is
las
very
personas sepan
important
que
so
existimos.
that people know that we
Un trabajo que
exist.
hemos desarrollado 23 años
We have
en
worked
nuestra
on this
provincia de
for
Santiago de Cuba.
23 years in our province, Santiago
De
de
vital importancia la aprobación del Código de las
The
Familias,
approval of the
las
Families
personas
Code is
LGBT
essential because
tuvimos grandes
LGBTI
beneficios
persons
con la aprobación de
were
este código tan novedoso, un código de
impacted
amor,
very
un
positively
código
with
que respalda
this
todos
code,
nuestros
which is a code of
derechos,
love,
es
a code
inclusivo
that
y
supports
muy
all
justo.
our rights,
La
which is
aprobación del
very
Código de las
inclusive
Familias
and
en Cuba fue
fair.
de vital
The
importancia.
approval of this code was uh, essential for us.
Desde el primer momento que se supo la existencia del código, nos
Ever
dimos a la
since we
tarea
knew
junto a los
of
juristas
the
de la
existence of
provincia
the code,
a calificarnos,
we worked with the jurists
capacitarnos referente a estos
to
temas para poder
train on
entender
this
qué es
issue
lo
so
que se
that we could
pretendía
understand
con este
what
código y
the
una
code
vez
was
estudiado, pues lo dimos a conocer en
seeking.
nuestros centros
And
de
once we
estudio, de
started this,
trabajo, en nuestras
we shared it
comunidades,
with our
defendiendo
communities, with our
siempre
central
lo
society,
inclusivo y que era el código
always
del amor, donde
defended
todas y todos
defending
estábamos
the
representados.
inclusiveness of this
Fue
code,
muy
which was a code
importante el
of love.
activismo a
It was
nivel de
very
las redes
important for
sociales.
us
Siempre
to do
tuvimos ataques
activism at the
fundamentalistas
social media
religiosos
level.
y
We
homofóbicos,
received attacks
pero supimos
from
soltar,
homophobic people and religious
exponer todos los
fundamentalists,
argumentos
but
que
we were able
implicaba la aprobación de este código.
to support
El código de la
the
familia en
code in
Cuba
the end.
nos llevó en primer lugar a estudiarlo, a ser
This led us
capacitados por la Unión
to
de Juristas en
study and
Santiago de
to
Cuba.
train with the
Eh,
Union of
y una vez
Jurists
capacitados,
in
pues
Santiago
nos
de
dimos la
Cuba, and
tarea de
once we were
divulgarlo entre
trained,
nuestras personas
we
de las redes
were tasked
sociales,
with
las
sharing
comunidades,
this with our communities
de
on
nuestros
social
barrios, de nuestra
media
provincia. Y
and people in
las
our
personas LGBT
province,
desarrollamos
and
una ardua labor
we
a
did
nivel
a
de las redes
very
sociales, donde
arduous
fuimos atacados
work
muchas
on
veces
social
por
media.
los
We
fundamentalistas religiosos y por
were
diferentes
very many
homofóbicos,
times
porque nos atacaban
attacked
totalmente.
by homophobic people and
Gracias a todo el trabajo que se hizo por
religious
instituciones,
fundamentalists.
organismos y
And
diferentes
thanks to
medios,
our
se
work,
logró que la aprobación
work
fuera de un
done by different organizations, there was
61,96%
a
de aprobación y
61.96%
entonces felizmente fue
of
aprobado
approval.
este código de
So
amor.
this code of love was finally approved by the majority of the people.
Thank you so much again to Isel Calzadilla for sending us those video messages. It was not easy. She said that there's been regular power outages happening in her community, and she's been working hard to create such a lovely presentation for us. Thank you again to our interpreters for their work. I know it was not an easy task, but they did excellent. And I think you got a really full picture of some of the work that Isel is doing in her community in Santiago de Cuba. I do have some photos that she sent us as well of their work. And I will also be bringing those as we go further into the event. I would now like to introduce to all of you our next speaker. And our next speaker is the wonderful Moon Luna Vasquez, a Puerto Rican lesbian activist with the U.S. Women and Cuba Collaboration Steering Committee since 2002. She's also a lead organizer of the U.S. Cuba Lesbian and Allies Project and a member of WILPF Cuba and the Bolivarian Alliance Issues Committee. She's been traveling to Cuba since 2001. She's a construction worker in non-traditional trades for women since 1985, a fundraiser, a community organizer, and Moon is also passionate about TNR, trap, neuter, and release of feral and stray cats, a gardener, and a fisher person. So thank you so much, Moon, for such an exciting biography, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. What an honor to be here with you today. Thank you to the International U.S.-Cuba Normalization Committee for inviting the U.S. Women and Cuba Collaboration's Lesbian and Allied Project to present on a topic that I am passionate about. I have spent a majority of my life living and working on the front lines, fighting and organizing for the rights of lesbian women and the LGBTQI2S+ community. From now on this presentation, because those letters are so long, I'm just going to say LGBTQ, okay, just as a given. Therefore, these issues that we're talking about are both personal and political to me. I am grateful when I think of the women and men, transgendered folks, bisexuals, asexuals, non-binary folks, two-spirit who have come before me and have struggled and laid the path for the rights of gay people. The Lesbian and Allied Project grew from a 2012 summit at El Mojunje in Santa Clara in the province of Villa Clara, Cuba. El Mojunje is a historic cultural gay center. In this meeting, Cuban and US lesbian women and our allies met to dialogue on a common lifestyle. The project was conceived to build alliances and solidarity and to bring awareness of the achievements and the struggles of the gay community in both countries. We have grown over the years, forging alliances between the two nations, building bridges and developing strategies to support la lucha of human rights of the LGBTQ community. In our work, we share the strategic and the personal, the work for equality, the historical, and the current reality of our lives and our celebrations. We compare notes, and Cuba always comes out on top in regards to achievements. On this day, I particularly remember there was a Cuban compañera sitting in the background, her name Maria de la Caridad Jorge. Her presence was strong and sturdy. You knew by her look that she had been on the forefront of the struggle for gay rights all of her life. She was one of the pillars of El Mojunje, and and of her community. I mentioned Maria and also a comrade friend of mine, Shan Ari from Philly. She loved Cuba and Cuban rum. I honor and celebrate these two lesbians for living their lives being warriors for gay and women's rights. Maria, a self-described revolutionary, activista, lesbiana, 100%. Shan always described herself as a radical dyke, fighting in the riots of Stonewall, a riot lasting 5 days against the gay community in New York. For us, it was a fight for gay liberation. Maria and Shan presente. One last story of the day at El Mejunje. We all laughed, we shared stories, and our biggest plan that day was to play a baseball game. We would commingle the teams, and in our charla, we always said that day that we were the best baseball players the world had ever seen. That day is where dreams continue. The collaboration is proud of our national speaking tours during a time when Cubans could travel to the US to speak for themselves on the progressive changes in Cuba. During their speaking tours, Norma Guillard, leader of Las Oremis in Havana, and Int'l addressed issues on gender and queer rights, presenting on Cuban and US lesbian voices. Int'l spent the last 2 months of her 6 weeks, speaking tour, traveling with Pastors for Peace before returning to Cuba. More Cuban comrades speaking with us at forums, LASA, the Latin American Studies Association, CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, community events, house parties, etc., were award-winning filmmaker Eric Kovalan addressing race in Cuba. Dr. Norma Visayo, chair of the Women's Studies at the University of Havana, speaking on economic changes in Cuba, impacts on women and their families. Grisela Aranda, journalist and researcher, presenting on issues of race and identity, based out of UNIAC, the Cuban Union for Artists and Writers. To our dear friend and comrade, Isabella Moya Richardson, a journalist and feminist. She taught communication studies where she integrated feminist theory. Isabel presente. Our collaborative work with Cuba helps us educate and inform US citizens about the progressive Cuban human rights at a time when many of these human rights are being lost across the US. As Cuba progresses, the US regresses. Cuba is inspirational on their transgendered human rights stance. Under the leadership of Mariela Castro Espín, working as the director of the National Center for Sex Education, Cenesex, and director of the National Commission of Comprehensive Attention to Transsexual People, Cuba has had some of the most progressive national laws and protections in the world for LGBTQ plus population, including a recent adoptive revised version of the Constitutional Families Code, which Aza will talk on this later on after my presentation. Thank you so much, Aza. It's always a pleasure to present with you. I'd also like to take this moment also to tell and salute Int'l in Cuba. Un abrazo, querida hermana. Hasta la victoria. Un beso, un abrazo. Over 2 decades ago, Fidel Castro identified gay rights as a blind spot in the Cuban Revolution, and based in the scientific research of Cenesex, Mariela's work for sexual health and well-being of all Cubans have resulted in international acclaim. The U.S. Women-Cuba Collaboration and WILVS Cuba and the Bolivarian Alliance Issues Committee applauds the leadership of Cuba and Cenesex on their recent annual celebration of International Day Against Transphobia and Homophobia. Celebrated in the U.S. as National Transgender Day of Visibility, and in many countries of the world as fundamental celebration of transgender human rights. We call for the U.S. to join the world's nations and see trans rights as human rights and celebrate this day as well. We call on the U.S. and other countries of the world to honor the promise of these celebrations and realize laws and genuine practice of justice, respect, and inclusion of the lives and safety and well-being of all transgender and other LGBTQIA2S+ individuals. Okay. We stand in solidarity with trans people and LGBTQ+ individuals and communities globally, and we condemn anti-human rights and anti-democratic actions and legislation. These fear-based policies attempt to divide and conquer, and they are structural and direct forms of hate and violence designed to increase political methods of social control over our human rights to bodily autonomy. We stand together with LGBTQIA2S+ communities across the world, united in diversity. I invite you to read our statement issued for Pride Month, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, which is posted in English and Spanish on our website, www.womenandcuba.org. And in closing, our strongest message to President Biden: let Cuba live, take Cuba off the list of state-sponsored terrorism. No country who enshrines the rights of LGBTQI+ people can be terrorists or sponsors of terrorism. No al bloqueo, que viva la revolución cubana, que viva las mujeres y hombres en solidaridad. We also welcome you to join our work. Thank you very much for your time. Please look at our website. There's a list of links, hopefully put on the chat. Look at the links and yeah, let's keep forging ahead. Let Cuba live, let Cuba be free.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, Moon. That was phenomenal. And
Thank you so much.
A real example for Aza, how to speak slowly to help our interpreters.
I only do that because if I talk really fast, I get myself more nervous. Okay, it's a strategy. Come on, Aza. Hey, nice to see you, Aza.
Because she starts slowly, but as she gets more passionate.
Yeah. Hey, man, don't order. Let her be. Déjala quieta.
So thank you so much to Moon. As you can see in the chat, we have posted all of the links to learn more about the work of the U.S. Women and Cuba Collaboration and their Lesbian and Allies Project, how to get in touch with them, as well as the recent statements that they've made that Loon spoke about, and as well as other links that Moon is recommending you check out to learn more about this important work. So thank you so much for that. Before we go to Aza, who will be our final speaker, and then we'll have a chance for some Q&A, I want to also read just a short message of greetings that we received from Addis Darlington. who I know is a friend of Moon's in Havana, Cuba. And this is a photo of Adis. And she sent a message in English to us, but just typed on Facebook, and it said, the achievements of the LGBTIQ plus community in Cuba have been significant, not only throughout every May in 16 years of the Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia, but also within the legal, cultural, social, and therefore political framework. The legalization of same-sex marriage in Cuba has been a major success, the greatest of all. However, there are still cultural taboos and barriers of various kinds. It is incredible that we continue to call them Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia when it should be the Days Against Homo, Lesbo, Transphobia, because what is not mentioned is rendered invisible. In fact, during the 16 sessions of the event, it was only at the 10th session in 2017 that women activists performed as artistic women in drag to carry out amateur performances at Havana's Karl Marx Theater. It was incredible and very unique. And so Adis wanted to send this message to our meeting today, and we thank her for that message of solidarity and a reminder that we have, Cuba has made so many important gains, and that there are still gains to strive for, and that we are, supporting Cuba in that and learning from Cuba in that, as Moon mentioned, with the struggles that are now happening in the United States and Canada. So I'm very honored to present our next speaker, Asa Rojbi. She's a North African queer activist and board member of Fierté Canada Pride. Asa is also the coordinator of Friends of Cuba Against the US Blockade Vancouver, and Asa participated in the Cuban Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia in Havana, Cuba in 2016. She's also a member of the editorial board of the Fire This Time newspaper, and she is the author of US and Saudi War on the People of Yemen by Battle of Ideas Press. So a big welcome to the webinar, Asa Rojbi.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Moon. So nice to see you virtually. We have to do a reunion that's not on Zoom sometime soon. Thank you to Aaron, and thank you to everybody that's here with us today. I am going to follow Tamara and Moon's advice and speak slow, because I know that our interpreters are doing an amazing job to make the webinar bilingual. And as Tamara said, I do tend to get excited if I care about an issue, and yeah, that's not the point. The point is that people can understand what I'm saying, not the excitement. So I'm going to do my best today, and I think this is a really also like an important day for us to be having this webinar, a day after remembering Stonewall and what Moon was talking about. We're standing and we're sitting in the shoulders of folks that came before me. I am a queer activist today, but I would not be here without the voices that have fought all over the world before me and still continue to fight. So I think it's an important acknowledgement for us here today, as really Moon started us very well by acknowledging who came before us, who started this fight for social justice, for human rights, for queer rights, and how we continue it today, but also how we can look at a country, at Cuba, a country like showing us an example of how things could be different, could be done differently for human rights and for queer rights. I have a big plan of being able and share photos at the same time, so bear with me because I have not had time to prepare my photos much earlier today, as I'm sure all of you have thousands of photos of Cuba, and when you start to try to select from them, later you find yourself that you're wasting time just reminiscing on being in Cuba. So I selected what I think is the best that I would like to share with you today in this important webinar, because I want to start by giving a bit of what I think is a good context for starting, which is, as Moon alluded to, I'll be focusing on talking about the new Families Code and what does that mean to Cuba, but also what could we learn from it for folks that are fighting for queer rights and human rights across the world. And so to look at the Families Code, we need to see this new Families Code and generally the queer movement in Cuba within the history within the history of Cuba, and also within the reality of Cuban popular democracy and the important work that the most popular institutions do in Cuba. Since the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, Cuba has encouraged the Cuban people to organize, to mobilize in mass organization, whether that is Cenesex, as people referred to before me, or the FMC, the Federation of Cuban Women, or the Federation of Cuban Students, whether there is a student at a high school level, at a primary school level, at a university level. The Cuban society is organized within mass mobilized institutions. And this is the dynamism of a country that pushes for constant motion, constant change, being pushed, being presented by the population, by the Cuban people. And I truly believe that this new families code that is now a law in Cuba is something that really shows to all of us firmly that Cuba is a revolution in motion. Cuba is not a stagnant country. It's a country that is constantly feeding to information from its population, to legislation, to changes, to advances. And I think that the new families code is just a new example of that. So here's my big plan for all of you today is I would like to talk a little bit about this and try to demonstrate what I'm referring to as Cuba's dynamism and and the motion of Cuban society that brought us to today, which is the passing of the Families Code. And I want to relate that through my personal experience of traveling to Cuba. I don't have photos from this, but my first time traveling to Cuba was in 2012. And that was a year before I moved to Canada with my family from Tunisia. So I was a queer activist at that time in Canada, but I was still, I would say, a baby queer activist, still learning and from people that came before me, but also just still trying to find my place. And a year after that, I did travel to Cuba, and it was really a life-changing experience for me. And a little part of that I wanted to share is an experience I had in Holguin. So I was part of the brigade that goes from Canada, which is called the Che Guevara Volunteer Work Brigade. And we were in the city of Holguin. This is 2012. I think it was like one of those free afternoons you get in the very, very busy brigade programs that we all went through. We were walking in the streets of the city of Holguin. And I suddenly, kind of out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that looked like a rainbow flag. Of course, I walked toward it, and it was a poster. My Spanish wasn't as good at that time, but I could understand from it that there was going to be an event that same night, and there was going to be a movie showing about an LGBTQ plus movie in Cuba. Again, this is 2012 in Holguin. And that's how basically the first time I learned about Cuba's International Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia. These days, as Tamara mentioned earlier, this year is the 16th year that this is happening every year, but not only in Havana. This was 2012 in Holguin, in a really tiny, small community center. And so I was really excited to see what the queer community in Cuba was and to learn more about this event. So I was able to convince the brigade organizers to take us back that same night where the movie is supposed to be playing, to go and watch it and get to meet the people that are organizing this event. So it was, I won't go too much into detail, but it basically was kind of, really interesting because this event was for the Cuban population. It was an educational tool that Cenesex uses every year to educate about queer rights all over the country for the Cuban population. So the organizers of the event did not anticipate that 30 or so people from Canada that only, most of them only speak English are just gonna show up at their event uninvited, take over the seats, and just join them in this movie showing that they were doing. And it was for me very important because it was my first introduction to the work of Cenesex, to what is Cenesex, and to the work that they do. And I think for a lot of us that travel to Cuba, it's really important because every time you go, you would see parts of the works of Cenesex sometimes in the population. in whether that is a poster, whether that is you are in a school and you see, you know, a little like information about the work of Cenesex on the corner of the billboards. Everywhere in Cuba, the work of the Center of Sexual Education, Cenesex, is presented to the population. I even saw posters about the days against homophobia and transphobia in barbershops. I don't even see posters about queer rights in barbershops in Canada. But this is important because it shows you how through mass mobilization, the work of Cenesex and the work of Cuba in changing mentalities, in educating people is at all levels. And so this is for me was the introduction to the start of seeing the development of queer rights in Cuba up to where we are today, where we are celebrating the passing of this amazing families code. But this is the work of people for years and years in Cuba, doing this work in small communities, in Havana, and all cities across the country. And I want to quick jump forward from 2012 to 2016, where, as Tamara mentioned earlier, it was my first time attending in Cuba the annual days against homophobia and transphobia. So at that time in 2016, this was the 9th annual edition. And this is where I am going to start sharing my screen and talking at the same time. So let's see if all of that goes well. Okay, share. All right. I think you should all be able to see my screen. And so this first photo that you see is from those International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia.
Sorry, Aza.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We have a black screen here. It does say Aza Rojbi has started sharing, but there's no.
Oh, you don't see anything?
No.
Okay, well, that's not exciting. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, so I stopped sharing. Did you see anything at all from the beginning, or you saw just nothing?
Just nothing, just black screen.
Okay. All right. I want to try again, and please let me know if it's the same problem. Okay. Do you see anything now?
No.
Okay. Very interesting. Still nothing?
Still nothing.
Okay. I'm going to move it to the other screen because I have 2 screens. It is possible that one of my screens today decided that it does not want to share. So.
All right, I'll give you a moment to work on that, Aza, and I'll make a quick announcement. I want to take this opportunity of technical error to let folks know about a few different events that are coming up. Some of you know that every single month, the Puentes de Amor, or Bridges of Love, is building for monthly actions on the last Sunday of every month. Recently, as Erin mentioned, on June 25th was an International Day of Action where folks took to the streets on the last Sunday of the month, which was June 25th, to demand an end to the criminal US blockade on Cuba, and for this International Day of Action with a special focus on demanding that the Biden administration remove Cuba from the so-called state sponsors of terrorism list. And there was a rally in Washington, D.C. in front of the White House, but there were also actions that took place across the United States, as well as across Canada. Here in Vancouver, we had a very exciting and dynamic car caravan, which we have on the last Sunday of every month. And then following that, picket action at the US consulate in Vancouver. As we continue this work on the last Sunday in August, folks will be gathering, or sorry, the last Sunday in July, I'm skipping a whole month, which will be July 30th. Folks will be taking to the streets again in caravans and protests, as we continue to build bridges of love, puentes de amor, and we continue to work together to demand an end to this criminal over 60-year blockade on Cuba. Part of the work of the campaign is also this postcard, which I'm hoping is showing up not in mirror view for all of you. I think it looks good. This is a postcard too that says, "Hey, President Biden, Cuba is not a sponsor of terrorism. Remove Cuba from your list." And this is a postcard campaign that has been launched by Friends of Cuba Against the US Blockade Vancouver and the New York, New Jersey Cuba Sea Coalition, and is now endorsed by IFCO Pastors for Peace, Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, the Seattle Cuba Friendship Committee, and the European campaign Unblock Cuba. Thousands of postcards have been shipped to Friends of Cuba across the United States, Canada, Europe, and we're hoping that thousands have also been mailed into the White House as we try to bring attention to the US government to this campaign. As a part of this campaign, we're also asking folks to take photos of themselves as they're mailing their postcards, to send those on social media to let people know that Cuba does not belong on this so-called state sponsors of terrorism list. If you would like some copies of the postcard, we're going to be posting information in the chat on Zoom as well as on Facebook so that you can get some postcards to send yourself to the White House and to share with your friends. It's something you can do monthly or weekly. It's not a petition where you've signed it once and you're done. You can keep mailing these in regularly and keep bringing this to the attention of the Biden administration. So please make sure that if you're interested to join this postcard campaign, to get in touch. We'll get the postcards to you so that we can continue building this important campaign. All right, Aza, how are we doing?
We are gonna try, and then hopefully we're doing good. So I am going to share this other screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. It looks beautiful.
Okay. Luckily, we're good. Okay, so as you can see in this image, again, I'm taking everybody back with me to 2016. While I was attending the 9th Annual Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia in Havana. As I also mentioned, these, and as also others mentioned before me earlier, these events are not only events that take place in Havana. That's also, you know, I'm referring to the photos from my experience, but they take place all over the country, whether that is you are a small rural town in Santiago de Cuba, or if you are in the capital in Havana. This first image that you can see is for me, was again, another introduction for me to the work of Cenesex and to the advancement of Cenesex and the work of the queer movement in Cuba. Because a lot of the discussions and a lot of what we see in today's new families codes are discussions that have been happening in these places in Cuba. These are the organizers, the people in Cuba that have been mobilized in their mass organizations, pushing for the changes that we are seeing today in the new families code. And this discussion that I was able to attend that day as part of the conference, part of the Days of Action, was specifically talking about discrimination against trans and LGBTQAI+ people in workplaces. And so those are conversations, and those are rights that our Cubans have protected today under the Constitution and under the new families laws. But these are conversations that people, and discussions and debates that the people of Cuba have been having for years, building to this moment today of the new families code. As you can see in this image, of course, at the far front of Cenesex is the work of Mariela Castro, which we were able to hear from earlier today. And at that time, myself and Janine Selecki, also from Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, were able to go and talk to Mariela and give her some of our t-shirts that actually we make here in Vancouver to march our Vancouver Pride, representing Cuba, fighting also against the blockade while being present in Vancouver Pride here in Canada. So we were able to exchange with her and talk. And again, as you saw today in her talks, somebody with a knowledge of information to share. This is another event with a different nature that I want to stop here and focus a little bit. This event was organized and the focus was the rights of trans people. And so this was an event where we were able to attend and hear from a lot of families, either families that are have parents that are supportive of them or family members that are not supportive of them. But the whole discussion was basically, what is today the new families code? What is a family in terms of having family members that are trans or queer? And so it was really a kind of very interesting and emotional place to be, because there were a lot of trans people that were here with their parents that were very supportive of them, which is something that even sometimes hard for me to find here in Canada, to go to spaces and find queer people or trans people with their parents that are overly supportive of them is not, you know, is something that cannot be taken for granted. And it is something that we saw in Cuba, that a lot of these parents were part of Cenesex and were part of this movement. And I think something that is really important to reflect on is that trans people in Cuba have had access to free gender-affirming surgery since 2008. This does not even exist in North America, in the US or in Canada. You can have trans-reaffirming surgery in Canada, but you have to wait in a very, very long wait list. And you have to pay so much money to access it. And I'm pretty sure the situation in the US is not better. And so we're talking about a country like Cuba, who since 2008, trans people had access to that surgery as part of the public healthcare system, which is how it should be. And also it's important to reflect that additionally in Cuba, trans people have had the right to correct their legal names and gender on official documentation without having to go through the surgery since 2013. So since this new families code, again, this is to the point of showing the dynamism of the Cuban society and the Cuban Revolution, all these changes that are happening, building to what is today the most advanced families code in the world is what Cuba have. And it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of all of this dynamism of the Cuban Revolution that we see and that we saw. And a lot of us through traveling to Cuba have been able to witness it ourselves and have those experiences ourselves. This is I also wanted to share this photo because it is from that same event. And again, this is photos and images that people made imagining what their family would look like. So you can see that are like wedding images at that time, where is, again, this is a right that Cubans have today, same-sex marriage. But at that time, these were things that people were working on. These were debates that people were pushing to have in the society. These were pieces that people were educating the society about. And as we saw in the video earlier today, also a big part of the days against homophobia and transphobia is the big conga, which is a more exciting, less corporate version of our pride parades that we all have, which are a very important places to have and to continue fighting for. But when you compare that to being in Cuba near the Malecon, to being with revolutionary people in Cuba in the streets, fighting for the rights of queer people, marching near the ocean and yelling slogans like homophobia no, socialismo sí, is a very important experience. And I would encourage any of you, if you haven't traveled to Cuba, to attend the conga. I think it's a very, very important and a very exciting event to go once in your lifetime to join Cuba's march against homophobia and transphobia. This is, again, I think another important part of the march always is the demand, is the politicization of the marches. These are marches of people that are proud of who they are, but they are always demands. And in this case, as I was saying, that year, the demand was, I am included, and also no to the blockade. So a lot of the demands that you see in Cuba, including in the march against homophobia and transphobia, are people that are demanding and asking for the lift of the cruel US blockade against Cuba. I want to pause a little bit in this also, because I think this image builds again to today. And if you haven't seen it yet, I will post later a really heartwarming and a beautiful Facebook group that was created in Cuba around the time of the New Families Code, around the time of where people were mobilizing for the vote. And when I was part of this Facebook group at that time, all the photos and the images that were in it were campaigns. So they were slogans, there were educational materials that Cenesex and other institutions in Cuba have created to propagate encouraging people to vote yes and explaining why a yes vote for the New Families Code is going to expand the rights of all. But right now, since the passing of New Families Code, this Facebook group has become a place where people are posting photos of their weddings. And these are like same-sex marriages that are happening in Cuba since the passing of the New Families Codes. So it was really beautiful to see how this Facebook group that was being used as a tool for organizing of the passing of the New Families Code is right now really photos of people and their dogs at their weddings, beautiful photos of families, queer families. And I wanted to go to this photo from 2016 because those beautiful photos that I'm seeing today on social media were built on this, were built on the top of the fight of Cenesex over years of work of the Cuban society, mobilizations in the Cuban society, and this was one of them. And this image is at the end of the conga against homophobia and transphobia. We ended up in a big cultural community center for a big celebration. And this is 2016. So as part of that celebration was a symbolic wedding. And so as you can see, this is the front of the stage where, if I'm gonna go to the next photo, you will see that a lot of Cuban couples same-sex couples were in the crowd celebrating their weddings symbolically in 2016. These are couples that today, under this very progressive New Families Codes, can celebrate their weddings with families publicly and officially, not only symbolically. And so I took this photo. I wish I can find these people and pass it to them. I think it's such a beautiful photo of this really symbolic union that was happening in Cuba in 2016 to symbolize love and to symbolize the queer rights movement in Cuba. As you can see, these are all couples that at that time took the symbolic vows in 2016, same-sex couples. And you can see the happiness and the joy in the faces of these people and in the hugs of these people. And these are the same Cubans that have fought to continue to mobilize their society through the work of Cenesex, through the work of the Federation of Cuban Women, through the student movement in Cuba to push for this New Families Code. And this is my final photo from that, from the 2016 Days Against Homophobia and Transphobia, that I wanted to finish on it to also give you an idea of the crowd and the number of people and the colorful people that are attending these days of homophobia and against homophobia and transphobia that have been happening for 60 years now in Cuba. I have stopped, I think, successfully. Now you should only be able to see me. I will go back to sharing a few more photos later on, but I want to, again, jump a few more years to 2022. 2022, I was able to travel to Cuba as part of the Che Guevara Volunteer Work Brigade. And I see through the chat that some other people that also were on the brigade are here. So hello to everybody and nice to see you online. So I wanted to jump to 2022 because we happened to be in Cuba the summer before the vote was going to take place about the New Families Code. And we had workshops and we had exchanges with people where we learned about the New Families Code, and we learned about the work of the Cenesex, NFMC, and other Cuban institutions in the education piece about this New Families Code. So I wanted to refer to some of that in this section before I share some more photos. And given the context of the passing of New Families Code, I think we also have to go back to 2019, where in Cuba, 86% of the Cuban population approved and passed the new constitution. The new Cuban constitution passed in 2019. It's a constitution that stands for human rights and the protection of the Cuban people. And this Families Code is basically the continuity of that constitution, and it further expands and protects all Cuban families. And I wanted to share from my experience, and I'm sure you all had, if you have traveled in Cuba in the summer of 2022, and you had discussions, and not only with Cuban officials, but people in the streets were talking about the new families codes. It was a discussion around dinner tables about people learning and actually teaching us about what the new families code means for their neighborhoods, means for their grandchild, means for their son, means for their daughter. And we also were able, through the Che Guevara Volunteer Work Brigade, to attend some of the workshops where we had a specialist and expert that explained to us about the new families code. So I wanted to share a little bit of what I learned from that. And so it's important to think about the new families code as not a legislation or a code that's written only by lawyers or by legislatures. It was a result of a lot of research and work of many years by sociologists, psychologists, doctors, statisticians, social workers, and as I was mentioning earlier, the work of mass institutions in Cuba, such as Cenesex and the FMC, and all the student movement in Cuba, but also through the work of the healthcare system in Cuba and through the work of a lot of doctors in Cuba as well. And again, this is information that was shared with us through the panel on the new families code that we were able to attend. And we were able to hear directly from some of the sociologists that actually were part of working on the family code. And it was interesting listening to her, and she was explaining to us how writing and building this new families code was based out of the input of the Cuban population, but also the input of all this expert, that this was a very collaborative process, a process that had a multidisciplinary team working on the researching of this and then working on the drafting of this new families code. I believe that this new families code is another revolutionary step, is another step in the revolutionary process of Cuba. It further consolidates the human rights of the Cuban people. It further consolidates the definition of families. It expands on the definition of family. And it consolidates and expands on the rights of the Cuban people, the rights that they've achieved since the revolution. In no way this new families codes limit any existing rights of any Cuban. It, as I said, not only expands of them, it takes them even further than the rights of a lot of people around the world. And it makes this new families code the most progressive one in the world today. And I am going to stop here for a second to share a few more photos. And so bear with me. As I said, I had big plans for today. So I am going to share some of the photos from 2012. It's a much less, a smaller slideshow than the one I previously had from 2016, but I thought these are important photos also to show, to give you some of the vibe that we felt when we were in Cuba in 2012, again, at the time where there were discussion happening before the passing of the new families code. Okay. So, sharing screen. Okay. I think you should be able to see it. I'm sure I will hear Tamara's voice if you cannot see my screen.
It looks great.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. So this again is a photo from the summer of 2022 in Cuba. And as you can see, what I was saying earlier, the work of Cenesex and the work of a lot of organizations like Las Isabelas, but also Trans Cuba, which is a network of trans people in Cuba. These are all organizations that within the Cenesex have been pushing and continuing to campaign for the rights of queer people in Cuba. This goes back to what Moon was mentioning earlier, El Mejunje, and so much history is in that place in Santa Clara. And actually, thank you, Moon, for sharing that. I didn't know a lot of what you shared about the history of that place and its connection also to the work of folks in the United States, and how much really that place, not only I think out of it came ideas for the queer movements in Cuba, but clearly for folks in the United States, and I know for us here in Canada as well, when we visited at the Che Guevara Brigade, it was a place that it's a little bit sad to say that I don't think I've been to a place in Vancouver for queer people that is this dynamic as in Mehunhe. Such a place where people can go for coffee, to watch a music show, to watch a drag show. It's also a place where at the time of the pandemic, they were collecting donations and they were making food to give to their neighbors when everybody was home and they weren't supposed to leave. It was also a place where they had educational forums. They had debates about the new families code. It is basically not only a queer community center, it's a library, it's everything. It's a place for that dynamism of the Cuban Revolution, that dynamism of the queer movement in Cuba. And although I was only fortunate to visit it twice while I was in Cuba, but it is definitely going to be added to my list of places to go to whenever I travel to Cuba. And if you do go to Santa Clara, I would also suggest that you visit El Mejunje, and you can feel that community vibe, but also that fighting spirit of the Cuban people. Inside of El Mejunje, you know, we were able to watch a show, but also talk about the blockade and talk about Che Guevara and talk about ideas of socialism and ideas about how to fight for a better world in this place that is also open to kids in the neighborhood to come and have programming about arts and culture. We were also learning from people that were working in El Mejunje that they have a traveling, not troupe, I can't think of the English word, but they do a traveling drag shows. And so they're taking drag shows to the most rural areas in Cuba, which is actually something here in Canada and in the United States that is now being protested against. It's something that if you take a drag show to some of the rural parts of this country here in Canada, you will have counter-protesters that are trying to take us backwards years in the rights for queer rights here in Canada. While in Cuba, you have movements like this that are building to educate people in all parts of the country. And yet here in Canada, when we do something like this, there is still all this hatred and all this protesting that is happening, while it's something that is now becoming normalized in Cuba. And so I think it's really important when we go to places like this in Cuba to understand from the experience of the queer movement in Cuba, and also look at how we can recreate things like this in Canada, but also just how we also can't, because we do live in a capitalist society where unfortunately the fight for queer rights is not on the top agenda of this government or of the United States government, but it is on the top agenda of countries like Cuba. I believe this was the last photo. So, and I'm going to the last section of my talk. I realized that my plan of showing photos and talking at the same time made it that I might be going over time. So I apologize, Tamara, and I apologize to the translators and to all of you that are with us here today. I had a big plan, but so little time. So I am going to, in my wrap up, I want to go to today, Cuba today. So, you know, we started in 2012, we went a little bit in 2016, 2022, now 2023. Love is law is what we are talking about. This new families code is a law in Cuba today. And it's important to think of that in the context of the United States and Canada. I am here in Vancouver and in Canada helping to organize queer events this summer. And part of what I have to think about is security, because of all the hateful attacks, all the attacks against the trans community, all the attacks against our community here in Canada, while we have countries like Cuba where we have actually an increase in rights, an increase in the people being in the streets, being who they are. Now we live in a country like Canada and the United States where there is an increase of the other way around, an increase of hate. And so that's why it's important that when we look at Cuba, we learn from Cuba. We learn that the important work that Cenesex does is constant campaigning. It's constantly fighting, it's constantly pushing the agenda for fighting for the rights of trans people and the rights of queer people, which is something that we saw here that, you know, years ago, the movement, the queer movement in the United States and in Canada was very politicized when we were fighting for our rights to even exist. But I think it's very unfortunate that the queer movement in the United States and in Canada in the last few years has lost that. We lost that radical fight that is the history of why we even got here. And I think now we're realizing that if we don't continue to fight for more, they will take away with what we have. And they are. The United States, a lot of states, you cannot be trans, be a youth, and exist in the US. And a lot of that is also in Canada trying to be recreated by some fringe right wings in the same thing in Canada that are trying to push this hateful agenda against the right of queer and trans people. And so for me, when I look at Cuba, when I look at the new Families Code, I learned from it. I learned that we have to be consistent, that we have to campaign. It is not enough that in Canada, for example, yes, we have the right to get married. Same-sex marriage is in law, but just because it's law, it doesn't mean that the majority of the population has understood how it became law, why it's important for it to be law, and why it's important for it to continue to be the law. And I think that's the important piece of the work of Cenesex in Cuba, is that laws are not parachuted top bottom to the people. The law already started from the bottom. The law came from the people, and the people, once they understand how much they fought for it, they will continue. And it is the same here. The laws that we have today, people fought for them. So that means that my generation and everybody that's around today, we need to continue that. We cannot take a break and say, well, I can get married in Canada, therefore it's enough. No, it is not enough, because the system will continue fighting against us to take away all the rights that they maybe one day gave us for a reason or another. If we don't continue to push for more, unfortunately, we all know in this capitalist system in the United States and in Canada that they will take it away any moment. So that is why I think looking at the new Families Code in Cuba is an inspiration of how we can continue to organize. And I'm really happy that this webinar, that we are doing this conversation with folks from the United States and from Canada. And actually, really, I think a great timing for the US-Cuba normalization to be organizing such a discussion today. And I hope this is a discussion that we can continue having from across the border between the US and Canada, of how we can learn from Cuba, but also how we can use Cuban example to relate to the fight of young people today in the US and Canada. Because if we are here in Canada organizing to tell people to join the fight, for example, to fight against the blockade, it's also important to explain to them how much is advanced Cuba in terms of queer rights, how much is Cuba advanced in terms of women's rights, because they are now living in a society in the US and Canada where those rights are being threatened. And so if they understand the example of Cuba and how Cuba is trying to do things differently, they will be even more eager to fight against the blockade, to fight for Cuba, because they know it's an example that we cannot lose. We need Cuba for all of us, not just for people in Cuba, but we also need it as an example for us that live in the West. And to kind of wrap up, and I think I got to the part of the excitement, and I apologize to the translators if I spoke too fast in the last section, but I want to add before I wrap up that I think, and I believe that this new Families Code in Cuba expands on the right of the LGBTQAI+ communities and families. It expands the definition of a family. It protects the rights of same-sex parents to have a family, whether that is through marriage, through adoption, even through assisted reproduction, which is also not a right that a lot of people in other parts of the world have, including how hard it is to go through assisted reproduction and how expensive it is to go through it in countries like Canada and the United States. These are now rights that are enshrined for Cuban couples, for Cuban families, for queer families in Cuba. And it's also important that in addition to this, and I will invite you all, if you haven't read a lot about the new Families Code, to do so, because it really expands on the rights of grandparents, it expands on the rights of children, it expands on really what is the rights of and the definition of a family. A family can be two men and their child, a family could be the grandparents and the child, a family can be two couples, and a family can be, basically is what you define your family to be, is what Cuba's new family code is. And it's a really, really progressive code from that aspect. It is also a code that expands on the rights of people with disability, on the rights of children and seniors, It expands on the also the protections of women's rights against domestic violence. It expands on the protection also of queer people against violence. And it's actually one interesting point that I didn't know even up to a few months ago, that this new families code, it's basically, in Cuba, it's considered domestic violence if you are a parent that disowned their queer child. This is something that happens in the US and Canada on a daily basis. Cuba codifies this as violence, and it is violence, because as a parent, that is your child that you have responsibilities towards. So you disowning the child, you kicking out the child, you're abusing the child is just because the child happens to be trans or queer is violence. And that's something that is in this new families code today in Cuba, which doesn't even, I don't think exists in Canada, or if it does, I have not heard about it, which is a very, very progressive thing to, learn about this new families code. So to wrap up, I think, and I hope that through my jumping through timelines and some images here and there, I was able to give you an idea of what I think is the dynamism of the Cuban family, what I think is also the dynamism of the Cuban Revolution. I believe this new families code really shows how alive is the Cuban socialist project, how alive is Cuba. And also, it also shows how close is the relationship between people and the leadership of the revolution in Cuba, including the government, including the popular mass revolutionary institutions. I was saying earlier, such as the Federation of Cuban Women, such as Cenesex, such as the University Student Federations, and others. And this relates to the work that we have to do as members of the queer movement here in the US or in Canada, or as allies, as people that believe that everybody should have access to equal rights, as people that believe and fight for human rights for all. We have to stand up for all the attacks that we are seeing on our trans brothers and sisters and on everybody today in the streets, even including during Pride parades, during Pride Month. These attacks are still happening against trans people, against non-binary people, against queer people in the United States and in Canada. So we need to learn from the example of Cenesex. We need to learn from the example of working, consistent campaigning is our tool. We need to continue to fight for expanding our rights as queer people in the United States and Canada. Because unfortunately, anytime we stop fighting for expanding our rights, we are seeing today that they are trying to take them backward. It's almost like we don't have a choice, and we don't have a choice. And so I want to really encourage all of you, and I know that a lot of you have been doing this for a year and are doing this for a year, whether that is in the United States or in Canada, attending Pride celebration and bringing Cuba to it. And I encourage you, if in your cities it's possible to do so this year or next year, is to plan for it. Here in Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, we've been marching every year in the Vancouver Pride Parade, in the Trans March, in the Dyke March, not only with banners that are calling to the end of the blockade, but also this year we will be focusing in talking about the new families code. And as also this year, as Victoria posted in the chat, folks in Toronto as well joined the Toronto Pride Parade, bringing the issue of Cuba, bringing the example of Cuba. And I know, and I've seen a picture of Moon and Cindy, I think, and also with signs. I'm not sure if it's the Seattle Pride Parade. Yes. And so I know that all of you in the US and a lot of you in the US are doing the same. And so I would encourage you to continue doing that, because I think, and I know for a lot of queer youth today, learning about Cuba is exciting. Learning about Cuba is inspiring, because our rights as queer youth in the US and Canada are under attack. Our rights as queer families in the US and Canada are under attack. Lives of queer people in the US and Canada are under attack. So we need to bring an example of how things could be done better, how things could be better by fighting for our rights. And I think Cuba is such a great example to share. And I'm going to wrap up here, and I hope that I can see some of you in person. If you live close to Vancouver, even if you don't live close to Vancouver, our Pride Parade is on August 6th. Come visit us in Vancouver, come march with us, come bring the issue of Cuba to the streets, to the queer community in Vancouver. And I'm looking to our friends in Seattle. It's a shorter drive to you than others in other cities. So maybe we'll see you here in Vancouver in August, which would be a great in-person reunion. And thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Azza, for a very well-rounded and comprehensive talk. We are running with about 15 minutes left with our translators, so we're going to probably just have time for about 2 questions. And I apologize to those that we won't get to today. There's a lot of great events that have been posted in the Zoom chat. Please check it out. There's upcoming actions in Toronto, in Wisconsin, in Vancouver, in Seattle, in New York. So lots of great information, including I have to also promote the Calixto Garcia Solidarity Brigade that's going to Cuba November 26th to December 8th. There's a Facebook page there to find out more about this exciting chance to travel to Eastern Cuba, and a possibility to go and meet with Int'l in Santiago de Cuba, which the Calixto Garcia Brigade did last year. All right, so our first question, without further ado, is many people in the LGBTQIA+ community think it is not safe to travel to Cuba as queer people. How can we in Canada and the US spread the truth and counter the US misinformation campaign? So I will send that question to Moon and let her answer.
Okay, great. Well, you know, Cuba is one of the safest countries in the world. I've been there since 2001. No one owns guns there. It's totally against the law. I've never even seen a gun. That's not true. I've seen probably 1 or 2 on police officers. So the track record that Cuba has and how you could, talk to your friends who are in the queer community is to invite them to come to Cuba, is to have them read articles on how safe Cuba is. And really the best way is to invite them down, because I could say it's not safe, that it's a safe country. You could tell them that it's safe, but until they go down and experience Cuba for themselves on so many levels, they'll come back a changed person. It changes your the lens that you look through and stuff. So, the gun violence in the US is off the hook. The violence against the queer community as well. And it is, Cuba really is one of the safest countries in the world. Invite your friends to go to Cuba. Tell them that, the US Women Cuba Collaboration is doing a lesbian, gay delegation in March, and so get them in contact with us. I put my name in the chat. You could follow me. You could get a hold of me on WhatsApp. I'd love to talk to them. Tell them to shoot me an email. I'll take the time out to talk to them about really the reality of the life in Cuba and stuff. So let's see who asked that question. I don't
Oh, it was Janine Solanke.
Janine, yeah. Okay, yeah. So if you also want to talk to me, Janine, shoot me an email. I'm good. A text message is even better. And then we could set some time up to chat about how safe Cuba really is and the reality of Cuba. Hope I answered your question.
I think that was great, Moon. Thank you so much.
But
I have 2 questions coming from Victoria in Toronto, and I'm going to pose them to Azza, but Moon, you're also welcome to jump in. They are, is there laws that protect kids from school bullying in schools in Cuba? What about policies or attitudes towards conversion therapy? So that's kind of 2 questions in one. And then another question from Victoria is also about homelessness in Cuba. In Canada and the United States, some studies have shown that 65% of homeless youth are from the LGBTQIA community. what does this mean in Cuba? And I think Aza actually addressed this question a little bit already in her talk, but I will bring both of those questions to you, Aza.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I would just quickly add that I would encourage folks to, as Moon said, visit Cuba for themselves and also join efforts like what Moon was suggesting about traveling with the, queer folks from the United States to learn about the LGBTQAI+ movement in Cuba. Moon, you mentioned this in March, right? I think.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
so that's also a great time to travel to Cuba. It's not too hot. It's not, it's not too busy. So I would encourage you to join, efforts like this where you can travel from whether that is the US or Canada and learn more about Cuba and directly ask you questions and exchange with folks from the queer movement in Cuba. For both your questions, Victoria, I will, somebody said they were being answered. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I would just want to start, and as Tamara said, I think for me, any country that puts as a domestic violence the abuse and the violence of a parent that kicks out their youth that happens to be queer or trans from their home is a country that puts people and youth and the protection of youth is at the forefront. And that's also a country that fights against things that, to Victoria's point, that we have huge here, which is the homelessness of queer youth. I'm sure the same problem is in the United States. This is not a problem that exists in Cuba. This is actually an epidemic in the United States and Canada of how much homelessness, the huge number of the homeless population because of this cruel and inhuman capitalist system that just disposes of people when they're not needing them or they think they're not productive. But at the same time, this is a huge problem for queer youth because a lot of the queer and trans youth, if they don't have the support of their parents, and then that's how they find themselves in the streets. And so when you have, in the United States or Canada, what we do when we have things like this is little band-aids here and there, but we can never really fix the issue because we're not trying to fix the root of the problem. But in Cuba, whether that is about homelessness or whether that is about queer rights, these issues don't exist the same way we have them in the US and Canada because they are tackling the roots. They are changing the mentalities of their society because they put human and people first, not profit first. So already the base of the system, of the socialist system in Cuba is to put people first, whether there is a queer youth, whether there is, a trans youth. And so I think it's the experience of a lot of us that travel to Cuba. You be in Cuba for 3 weeks or a month or so. And once you come back to Vancouver or your city in the US or Canada, and you start seeing homeless people again on the street, you get hit again by this, how much is normalized that to see homeless people in the US and Canada. But it shouldn't. These are other human beings that shouldn't have to live that way. But this is not something you see in Cuba. This is not something it's not normalized in Cuba. And I know that with the protections of the new Families Code, there is a lot of rights and protections that are offered to queer youth. There is a lot of rights and protections that are offered to families. And so in a lot of it also, because it expands the definition of a family, it also means that queer youth, if their direct parent is somebody that's abusive or not supported for them, their uncle can be their family, their grandparents can be their family, other people can be their family. They are not attached to, this patriarchal, your mom, your dad, you belong to them and you are a priority of you're a property of your parents. Therefore, when your parents don't agree with, the fact that you are this or that, they can decide to just kick you out of the house. This is not, this is not something that happens in Cuba because also partly this new Families Code expands the protection of all and expands the definition of a family. And because I think the most important thing that Cuba is doing differently, which I believe is the way to tackle homophobia and transphobia, is hitting the roots of it by educating the population from all aspects of life, not only saying, a little bit of band-aid issues here and there, like we do here, but then we know that the roots of the problems are not going to be touched because we live in a system that will put profits over the well-being of human being. Cuba is the other way. Cuba is a country that puts the well-being of humans ahead of profit. And in terms of the question about school bullying, I'm not aware of specific legislations about school bullying in Cuba, but I know that also, again, part of the new Families Code that expands the rights, especially of children, and the protections that are offered to children is one of the actually most progressive Families Code in terms of rights of children as well. And I think it's a very important piece because it also tackles this idea that, you know, parenthood or your children are your property, that, you know, it makes it into a relationship of responsibility and respect, not a relationship of a property. And so I think this new Families Code does protect and expand their rights of kids, whether there is in schools or whether there is in their families. And quickly about the convention therapy piece, that is also something that does not exist in Cuba, but there is a huge problem in the United States and Canada. I know there is still, you know, even Canada, there is still people fighting for banning all conversion therapies. I believe it's the same thing in the United States. Again, it's still something that people here are fighting for, but it's not an issue in Cuba. And just to quickly repeat myself, with this new Families Code, you know, this would be an abuse, because if you are a parent and your kid is queer and you abuse them because they are being queer, then that is domestic violence. The same goes for, if I were to expand the logic, it is domestic violence toward your child if you are forcing that child into conversion therapy. But this is not, you know, an issue that is in Cuba, and it is now something that is protected with this new Families Code as well.
I have a short, really personal story. I mentioned my friend Shan in my presentation. She was institutionalized for being gay. She had electric shock treatment for years in conversion therapy. It exists here. It continues to exist. Cuba is a country full of love. It is a country that, like no other. I was also with my compañera Cindy and a couple of other women. My friend Shan was in there. We were in Cuba, okay, and a couple other women. We decided we wanted to go. We're going to go visit Alicia from the FMC, and she lived way on the outskirts of Havana. Okay, so we drove, hired a car, young man. We get in there, you know. He takes us he stops, asks another guy for directions, and the guy says, "I could take you." And there's two strangers, young men, and there was all of us in the car. We're still alive today. That's Cuba. Yeah, tell your friends we want to expand the Lesbian Ally Project. Join our project. Come to Cuba with us. You will be a changed person, like I said before. U.S. Women Cuba Collaborations Lesbian Allies Project. A matter of fact, Adis is a member. You know, there's awesome women and men in Cuba that just love our projects. Trans, you know, just, I was looking for some pictures to post over here because we did at the Muhunge. That day was incredible. Just the camaraderie and the solidarity for being gay, queer in a world that does not accept us. In Cuba, you're accepted. Anyway, I could go on and on. Me and Aza, I love you, Aza. I do, my sister. Yeah, I do. Yeah, you fire me up. Thanks.
Moon, I did want to give you a chance just to give some closing comments. Our translators might have to leave. Oh, they're okay. So we are going to try and wrap up in the next 10 minutes, but I did want to give our speakers just a chance to give some closing thoughts. So Moon, I'll let you go first, and then we'll let Aza go. And just again, thanking everybody for being here with us with the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. We'll be posting our information in the chat again to follow us on Facebook. Keep up to date on the website. We are going to have a series of webinars coming up very soon. We've also been posting different events in the chat that are coming up that we want folks to participate in. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. And Moon, I'll let you wrap up with your final thoughts.
Okay, I just did the first series of final thoughts about Cuba and love and safety and stuff. I would like to thank everybody for the work that you all do continuously and we do as a force to educate the world, because of the US blockade on Cuba, hardly anything positive, nothing comes out of Cuba, you know, as simple as, is Cuba safe? You know, they want us to think, the United States government, you know, wants us to think that Cuba is a horrible country, you know? And I'm going to paraphrase this saying, we're not against our government, you know? We're in solidarity to continue to live to our convictions. And that's Reverend Lucius Walker. I hope I did that saying right that he did. I love you all. Continue to do the work you do. My comrades from the U.S. Women Cuba collaboration is really a collaboration of people doing, women doing awesome work. And we've been together for over 20 years, and we'll hopefully be together another 20 years if some of us could make it that long. And it's just, I am in awe of the Women in Cuba collaboration. Thank you, my sisters. I love you as well. Cindy, Jan, Lenny, yeah. Deb Goldman, my buddy from a million years ago, another awesome lesbian fighting for awesome rights for the queer community. I miss coming up to Vancouver and, you know, and presenting with you guys. You guys really, I do. I saw Aza and I was like, whoo, man, I needed to see her face, you know. Allison, thank you. And thank you very much to the translators, the interpreters. You guys, I didn't listen because, you know, anyways, because I was busy. Anyways, peace and love. Que viva la revolución. Okay, I'm done.
Gracias. Thank you so much, Moon. So now go to Aza Rojbi for your final thoughts this evening.
Thank you, Moon. Love you too, and hopefully we get to see each other in person. And thank you for everybody that stuck all the way to the end of today's webinar. Thank you for being here with us. It's really important that, and I want to thank the U.S.-Cuba normalization for putting this together, for bringing our voices, our queer, beautiful voices across the borders from the U.S. and from Canada, and uniting us here today. And just to wrap up, I think I want to relate to us here as folks that are either part of the queer movement or that are allies in the United States and Canada, is what we have to learn and what we can learn from Cuba. And I want to wrap up that what we can learn from Cuba is, and what we should learn from Cuba is, you cannot only, you know, gain your rights, you cannot only win your rights, you have to keep expanding for rights. You have to not only ask for more rights and fight for more rights, because that's the only way that we can guarantee what we have, is to expanding and continuing to fight for more. The best way that we have here in the United States and Canada, especially today that our queer movement is under attack, is to defend what we have and expand and ask for more. So this is a really important lesson that we should all learn from Cuba. The best way to defend is to continue expanding, is to continue fighting and asking for more. That's what we should do in Canada. That's what we should do in the United States. And I hope we can continue to learn this really important lesson that we learned today from Cuba and from this new Families Code. I hope that we can continue having this discussion that we had today, maybe, you know, with other different voices from the queer movement in the US and in here in Canada and in Cuba, because I know, and I see it every day in Canada and I see it every day in the United States, our rights are under attack. So we need everybody, we need all the allies and all members of the queer movements. We need to continue defending what we have and expanding to fight for more. And using Cuba as an example.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. I do want to let folks know that you can get a copy of Aza Rojbi's book, US and Saudi War on the People of Yemen, from Battle of Ideas Press at the website battleofideaspress.com. It's not on the theme of tonight's webinar, but of course, an important book about the war on Yemen and the need to end this US and Saudi-led war. But Battle of Ideas Press does also have 2 books on Cuba. My book, 5 Decades of the Cuban Revolution, The Challenges of an Unwavering Leadership, as well as Cuba's Healthcare System, Where Humanity Comes First by Ellen Bernstein, who many people know because she worked with IFCO Pastors for Peace for many years. So those are available on battleofideaspress.com. I want to thank Erin Feely-Nahem. I want to thank Isel Calzaria. I want to thank Moon Vasquez and Azza Rojbi all for their presentations today. Thank you also to Mariela Castro for sending us such a warm and beautiful message, and to Addie Starlington as well for her wonderful message to the webinar tonight. It's been such an honor to come together to discuss so many complex issues and such a big part of this work that's happening in Cuba, but really to come away so inspired for what it means for our struggle in the United States and Canada, how it can inspire us to do better in our own countries, how we can inspire the queer community with the leadership that Cuba is taking to build a better world. And so we continue together celebrating, demanding an end to homophobia, lesbophobia, transphobia, all attacks on the queer community, that we stand together with Cuba against the criminal US blockade on Cuba, that we stand with Cuba to say that Cuba does not belong on the so-called state sponsors of terrorism list, that we are going to continue to be out in the streets mobilizing, and we thank you all for being with us. Abajo el bloqueo, lift the blockade on Cuba, viva Cuba, viva Pride, long live el orgullo entre los pueblos, and let's keep working together. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Ciao.